Ethan Collins seemed like any ordinary teenager, but behind his calm smile hid a darkness no one could imagine. He burned his own grandmother alive and acted completely normal. It started like any ordinary morning in the small town of Maplewood. The sun rose slowly over the quiet streets, casting a warm glow on the neat houses and well-kept lawns. Birds chirped in the trees, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery. Life seemed perfectly ordinary, almost peaceful. But inside the modest home at the end of Willow Street, a darkness was quietly taking shape. 15-year-old Ethan Collins moved through the house with the ease of someone completely at home, but his calmness masked thoughts that were anything but ordinary. On the surface, he looked like a typical teenager. He slept late, spent hours scrolling through his phone, and avoided household chores whenever possible. Yet there was a coldness in his actions that no one noticed, a subtle precision in the way he navigated his small world. Ethan's grandmother, Mrs. Margaret Collins, had raised him with care and patience. A petite woman with gray hair neatly tied back in a bun, she had spent decades nurturing a family that now seemed unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. She had cooked his favorite breakfast without complaint, offered advice with gentle smiles, and assumed that her grandson's occasional mood swings were simply a part of growing up. To her, Ethan seemed like every other teenager, sometimes moody, sometimes quiet, but ultimately harmless. Neighbors often stopped by to chat with her on the porch, never imagining that danger could lurk so close. That morning, Ethan moved about the house with meticulous attention, performing mundane tasks in a way that made him appear responsible and caring. He tidied the living room, wiped down the counters, and even watered the small flower garden in the backyard. Each action was deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if he were carefully constructing the perfect image of a loving grandson. No hint of the malevolence he harbored slipped through his carefully maintained exterior. Outside, the world continued without suspicion. Children played on sidewalks, neighbors waved from across the street, and the rhythm of small-town life carried on. But within the walls of the Collins home, a sinister plan was quietly unfolding. Ethan moved through his day with the precision of someone planning far beyond the ordinary, leaving no trace of the darkness inside him. It was a calm that masked an unimaginable horror, a normalcy that hid the brewing storm. And by the time the sun reached its peak, the ordinary morning would give way to a series of events that would shock Maplewood and forever change the way the town viewed innocence and evil. By mid-afternoon, the quiet streets of Maplewood were disrupted by a thin wisp of smoke rising from the Collins house. At first, neighbors thought it was a forgotten meal or a small kitchen accident, something minor that could be ignored. But as the smoke thickened and turned dark, the scent of burning wood became mixed with a sharper, more sinister odor. Panic began to ripple through the street as people rushed to the curb, phones in hand, calling the fire department. Within minutes, the sound of sirens shattered the calm, and red fire trucks skidded to a stop, hoses uncoiling as firefighters jumped into action. Inside the house, the flames moved quickly, fed by a mixture of furniture, curtains, and unknown accelerants. Firefighters forced open doors, their boots heavy on scorched floorboards, eyes scanning for any sign of life. What they found was beyond imagination. In the center of the living room lay Mrs. Margaret Collins, her body consumed by fire. The heat had warped the furniture and walls around her, turning the familiar home into a scene of unrecognizable horror. The air was thick with smoke and the pungent scent of burning material, making it difficult even for the trained firefighters to breathe. Outside, Ethan Collins stood on the porch, a soda in his hand, watching the chaos unfold as if he were observing a scene in a movie. Neighbors stared in disbelief, whispering among themselves, unable to comprehend the sight of a calm teenager standing so close to a house engulfed in flames. There was no sign of panic, no frantic attempts to call for help or save his grandmother. Even the fire crews noticed his unnatural composure, a stark contrast to the fear and urgency around him. As the fire raged, investigators would later note the meticulous placement of flammable materials, indicating the fire was no accident. Ethan had been alone in the house when the flames began, and there was no evidence of anyone else entering or leaving during the critical moments. It was a crime executed with chilling precision, hidden behind the mask of normalcy he had perfected. The neighborhood would later recall the smoke, the sirens, and the disbelief of that day as something surreal, almost unreal. Maplewood's peaceful streets had become the backdrop for an unimaginable tragedy, And in the center of it all, Ethan Collins remained calm, almost eerily detached. No one could understand how a single teenager could orchestrate such horror and act as if nothing had happened. The answers would come slowly, piece by piece, revealing a darkness hidden behind a perfectly ordinary face. The investigation began immediately after the fire was extinguished, casting a shadow of fear and confusion over Maplewood. Detectives combed through the remains of the Collins house, carefully examining every scorched corner for clues. The charred furniture, melted plastics, and blackened walls made it difficult to piece together the sequence of events. But one fact was undeniable: the fire had been set deliberately. Traces of accelerant were discovered near the living room, confirming what authorities feared most. This was no accident, no careless mistake. Someone had planned the fire with intent, and the question on everyone's mind was chilling: who could do this? Ethan Collins became the focus almost immediately. He had been the only person inside the house during the fire, and witnesses described him as strangely calm outside, sipping a soda as flames consumed the home. Police reviewed hours of surveillance footage from nearby homes and traffic cameras, and everything confirmed what neighbors had seen. Ethan had moved through the day with an unnerving composure, showing no signs of panic, fear, or urgency. His calmness did not feel natural. It felt rehearsed, almost as if he had anticipated this moment. Detectives began to dig into Ethan's past. Teachers described him as polite but quiet, never drawing attention in class. Friends spoke of him as normal, someone who occasionally joked but mostly kept to himself. There was no obvious history of violence, no previous criminal behavior, no outward signs of anger or malice. Yet small details began to emerge that painted a different picture. Ethan had a fascination with fire, often watching videos of arson and crime scenes online. He had also shown an unusual interest in true crime stories, memorizing details that most teens would overlook. Psychologists later consulted on the case noted that Ethan exhibited traits often associated with sociopathy. He could mask his emotions perfectly, blend into society, and manipulate how others perceived him, all while harboring dangerous impulses. His behavior during and after the fire reinforced these observations. Even when questioned by police, he maintained a level of calm that unnerved everyone in the room. As the investigation unfolded, the town began to grasp a horrifying truth: evil can exist in forms that appear ordinary. The most chilling aspect was not just the act itself, but the ability of a teenager to commit such violence while wearing the mask of normalcy. Every piece of evidence, every interview, and every observation added another layer to the mystery, leaving Maplewood to wonder how a young boy could harbor such darkness behind a familiar, harmless face. As the investigation deepened, a clearer, yet more disturbing picture of Ethan emerged. Detectives discovered that in the weeks leading up to the fire, tensions had quietly grown between him and his grandmother. Mrs. Collins had recently made changes to her will, leaving Ethan only a small portion of her estate. While the inheritance alone might not have explained such a brutal act, it provided investigators with a potential spark. Yet, even this explanation seemed too simplistic for the calculated, cold-blooded crime that had taken place. Further examination of Ethan's personal space revealed an unsettling obsession with control. His room contained notebooks filled with meticulously written plans, diagrams, and notes about fires he had studied online. Some pages were marked with timelines and escape routes, almost as if he had rehearsed each step over and over in his mind. Investigators and psychologists alike were struck by how eerily organized and deliberate these writings were. They suggested that Ethan's motive was more than financial gain. It was about power, secrecy, and the thrill of carrying out a plan without detection. Interviews with neighbors revealed subtle signs they had missed at the time. Ethan often displayed a fascination with destruction, lingering a little too long at controlled burns or staring at fire trucks with unusual intensity. Teachers remembered assignments where he seemed to glorify cunning characters who outsmarted others, and friends mentioned his lack of emotional response to stories of pain or suffering. Each small detail contributed to a disturbing realization: Ethan had developed the ability to compartmentalize his actions and emotions, presenting one face to the world while hiding something far darker beneath the surface. Psychologists analyzing the case concluded that Ethan exhibited traits often associated with sociopathy, including a lack of remorse, shallow emotions, and an alarming capacity to manipulate his surroundings. The fire, in their view, was not merely an act of anger or retaliation, it was a meticulously planned experiment in control and dominance. He had chosen a method that would leave him unscathed, observing the chaos unfold from a distance, almost as if he were testing the limits of human attention and reaction. Maplewood, a town that had once felt safe and ordinary, struggled to comprehend the motives behind such evil. The horrifying truth began to take shape. This was not a simple act of greed or rage. Ethan's crime was calculated, precise, and executed with a level of detachment that shocked everyone who encountered him. The more investigators uncovered, the more unsettling it became to realize that the darkness behind his actions was hidden behind a perfect mask of normalcy. Even those who knew him best had been deceived by the outward appearance of a quiet, obedient teenager. The trial of Ethan Collins gripped Maplewood like no other event in recent memory. Courtrooms were packed, reporters filled the halls, and the townspeople followed every detail with a mix of fascination and horror. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic reports confirmed the deliberate use of accelerants. Eyewitnesses testified about his calm behavior outside the burning house, and investigators detailed the meticulous planning discovered in his notebooks. Every piece of the puzzle pointed to one undeniable conclusion: Ethan had intentionally set the fire that killed his grandmother. Even during the trial, Ethan's demeanor remained unnervingly composed. He listened to witnesses and reviewed exhibits without showing anger, remorse, or fear. Jurors described him as eerily calm, and some admitted feeling a chill simply by observing him. Experts testified about his psychological profile, explaining how he had the ability to mask emotions and blend into society while harboring dangerous impulses. They painted a picture of a young mind capable of cold calculation, someone who could carry out a horrific act while maintaining the facade of a normal teenager. As the prosecution presented its case, the town began to confront the unthinkable. Someone so young, someone they had considered innocent and ordinary, could commit such a heinous act. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It became a collective reckoning with the idea that evil is not always obvious. Friends, neighbors, and classmates struggled to reconcile the boy they knew with the person described in court documents and photographs of the charred house. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing evidence and testimony. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Ethan Collins was found guilty on multiple counts, including first-degree murder and arson. The sentence reflected the severity of his actions. Yet the chilling part of the story was not in the courtroom outcome, it was the realization that a teenager could plan and execute such a crime while showing no outward signs of guilt or emotion. Maplewood slowly tried to heal, but the shadow of what had occurred lingered. Parents watched their children differently, neighbors questioned how well they knew each other, and the town collectively struggled with the haunting idea that danger can exist behind the most ordinary faces. Ethan's story became a grim reminder that appearances can deceive, and the most horrifying acts can be committed by those who seem, on the surface, completely normal. The town would never forget that day, or the unsettling truth that sometimes evil wears the mask of everyday life.